Good afternoon and welcome to our weekly livestock market update. I'm Brownfield news anchor reporter Megan Grebner. With us is University of Missouri Scott Brown. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon, Megan.
We're talking a little bit early due to the Thanksgiving holiday and a shortened trading session on Friday. As we get into what's been going on this week, how have the markets been moving in this short week?
Yeah, so I think we're continuing to see more positive news on the cattle side. Futures up as we've gone through this shortened week, and number one, it's turned what's been some very large losses in cattle feeding side of the equation into something more palatable, albeit still not above break even. But it's nice to see some rally in cattle prices. I think we've been looking for that for a long period of time, and we're continuing to get some help on that front. Hog futures up a little bit so far as we look through this shortened week, and cash prices for hogs as well have been relatively flat as we've gone through the short week as well. So all in all, good news. I think when you look at the wholesale side of the equation, fairly flat on pork cutout values for the week, but we're actually up when you look at the cutout value on the beef side. So not only are we seeing good news in terms of farm level cattle prices, but we're able to push those wholesale beef prices higher this week as well.
And I would have to think that any week where we're not seeing big losses or consecutive weeks of losses in those markets has to be a feel-good sentiment for livestock producers around the country.
Absolutely. When you look at the fact that, we're up almost 3% in total production of beef, pork, chicken, and turkey for the year, anytime you can talk about higher prices in the face of what's been growing supplies, you got to be pretty happy about the situation.
Speaking of growing supplies, Scott, as we take a look at USDA's cold storage report came out this week, and there is a lot of numbers. Let's talk a little bit about what that report showed.
Yeah, first of all, when you look at the beef side of cold storage, 533 million pounds of beef in cold storage, an all-time record. That certainly has folks' attention, and we've been growing in terms of cold storage stocks of beef for the last several months, and it's not surprising, again, given that we've seen increases in production. But that number really gets one's attention. I'll remind us that although it is a record level of stocks, it's still small relative to overall production levels. We just want to understand that these rallies that we've seen of late, whether it's box beef prices or cattle prices, stocks is one of the things I think that could mute any kind of big rally in front of us. Those stocks overhang the market, and at some point in time could come back on the market and create some drag for us. I will say we are down in terms of chicken stocks relative to a few months ago, so that's some of the good news. When you look overall, we have just large supplies of red meat, both pork and beef. So maybe not the best news we wanted out of cold storage. And having all-time record beef ending stocks in October certainly tells us the situation that we face today with growing meat supplies.
When we talk about having this much red meat on hand and in storage, what significance does that have potentially for producers in the long run?
Well, again, I think it just continues to remind us that when we grow production at the levels that we have, and again, I go back to the nearly 3% growth in all meats in terms of production this year, that it does back up in terms of ending stocks. Now, I'll take the flip side of that for a minute and say, it's amazing we haven't grown stocks more than we have, and it tells me that domestic consumption has actually been fairly good when you look across beef, pork, and chicken consumption. Yes, we've been able to export a little bit more as we've looked through 2016, but it's really you and I and the average consumer in this country who's been willing to pick up consumption. And so maybe that's the good news in all of this, that stocks haven't grown even more given the amount of record supplies we have on the marketplace today.
Speaking of consumption and the folks that are picking up those products in the supermarkets and in the grocery stores, consumer sentiment came out for November, and that was a massive jump. Let's talk a little bit about what that means and how we see an almost 11% increase in consumer sentiment for November.
Yeah, when you look at where we're at, the overall index for consumer sentiment up about 7.5%. relative to October, up 2.7% relative to a year ago. Some numbers we haven't talked about in a long time in terms of sentiment. The one that really jumps out to me is that expectations that we see. The data that is out for November says it's almost an 11% increase in expectations, which tells me that consumers certainly are looking ahead more positively than we've seen for a while. And even the current situation up 4%. Relative to a month ago. So all of the numbers look very good. And again, we want consumers to be in a good situation in terms of, I want them to consume more beef and pork and chicken as we look ahead if we're going to keep prices at reasonable levels. So very good news we got out for that November expectations index.
We talk about being good news, but can it hang on? Can we see that through the end of 2016 and into 2017?
Well, Megan, I wish I could say we would continue that forever, but I don't think that's probably going to be the case as we look ahead. And in fact, if you looked at some of the preliminary November information, it would have been much more subdued in terms of the growth. And I think one of the things we're seeing in those final numbers is as elections are now behind us, consumers are looking ahead more optimistically than we've seen for a while.
Do you call that like an election effect? And would it really have mattered? Is it Donald Trump being elected, or is it just the fact that it's over?
I think number one, consumers are certainly glad to see the election over, regardless of who was elected where. So I think much of it had to do with just the fact that we're beyond elections at this point, and we can move forward. Now it's going to be, how do we move forward as a country in terms of what kind of policies do we decide we want going forward? What's Congress going to do? What's President-elect Trump going to do? All of those things matter, I think, much more on the longer term. But I think when you really look at what we got out of consumer sentiment, it's much more of just glad we're beyond the election and can move forward at this point, that I think has been much of the driver for the positives that we see.
Scott, I want to talk a little bit as we get into the holiday season. Everybody's been at the grocery store this week, and really there's been great prices on some of those featured items, as well as groceries in general. As you and I or other consumers make their way into the grocery store, is it a good reminder for them maybe to understand how affordable our food really is here in the United States?
Absolutely. I think this is a wonderful time to remind consumers how affordable food is in this country. When you realize that, we're down around 6 or 7% of consumer expenditures that goes to food in this country. And you compare that to, let's take a country like China, for example, where still 25% of their consumer expenditures go to food. It just reminds you of how affordable it really is. You go to the grocery store for Thanksgiving, and all of those folks that have been out there showing us what a Thanksgiving dinner cost remind us that in 2016, it's actually cheaper than 2015. And I don't think there's many products we purchase today as consumers where prices might actually fall over time. So again, it just reminds me that we are providing a very safe, affordable food supply to American consumers, and it's a good time to give thanks to agriculture in terms of what it's providing to today's consumer.
It is definitely a great time to be thankful. I think AFBF survey, Scott, showed that it was under $5 a person for their market basket survey. I don't know anywhere you can go and sit down and have a full big meal with a full plate of food for under $5 a person.
It is an amazing time, and again, I say record meat supplies certainly have factored into that, but it is a wonderful time, and we in the United States certainly enjoy some of the most inexpensive food that's available in this world today.
You bring up record meat supplies. Last week we talked another record run for slaughter numbers for pork. I'm assuming we won't see that this week with the shortened week and the holiday. As we talk about that and we talk about these big supplies of pork, I can't help but think about the Hogs and Pigs report and the fact that we've had several consecutive quarters where we've seen an adjustment in the numbers. How does that uncertainty and maybe those changes, what does that lead us to think about as we look ahead to December?
Yeah, so it is a little concerning. I think we've seen with what's now been record slaughter here in the last week that we're right up against perhaps what's capacity. I think some have wondered, are we pulling hogs forward because weights have been down? And if that's the case, you can be somewhat optimistic for what happens in 2016. Yet when you realize that USDA has gone back now for what's, I believe, 8 consecutive quarters and revised pig crop higher, you kind of wonder what we're going to get out of that December report we get right before Christmas. I don't know whether it'll be a good Christmas present or not for pork producers in the country, but with that report, do they come back and revise pig crop yet again? And most important for us is some of those inventory categories. What's the 60 to 119 weight group going to look like 6 months ago in terms of revisions they might have made, because we're going to be slaughtering those hogs as we in 2016. And if they again revise pig crop and so forth up in this next report, then we may have larger runs to deal with and we may get really tight. I will say, when you look at hog prices relative to pork cutout value, they're setting about 60% of the pork cutout value, which is historically towards the low end. I frankly will say I'm surprised how well the pork cutout values hung in as we've gone through this period of time. But we could really see a even further divergence between hog prices and pork cutout values if we're making very large runs these last few weeks of December.
Do we get nervous or a little uneasy that we could see another 1998, 1999 situation again if we exceed capacity?
So I do think there's the possibility of that. I like to remind us that the structure that we have in the pork industry today is a little different than where we were in 98 and 99. Probably a little better coordination going on in terms of hog runs relative to slaughter. However, I wouldn't want to be the producer that's out there holding hogs that doesn't have a market knowing that they've got to be sold between now and the end of the year. Because if you are holding that hog that doesn't have a shackle space, it's not going to be worth very much money. So we're sitting here just kind of right on the edge, and we know we got to get through this last quarter of 2016. Seasonally, we'll turn down, but we still know we're going to have a lot of hogs in 2017 as well to deal with.
Speaking of 2017, we have more capacity coming, but if these inventories aren't showing any relief, and we've talked before about the sow slaughter numbers as well, does it matter that much if we still have big runs of hogs coming that can into 2017?
Well, I certainly think we, again, see hog prices relative to pork cutout values at pretty low levels. Perhaps we can increase that ratio as we look ahead in 2017. But my concern is, where do pork prices go in 2017? And to me, the answer to that question is, so probably lower as we look in 2017. But the unknown is, what's our chance to be able to export more pork out of the United States in 2017? To help balance what's going to be growing domestic supplies. So we're going to continue to talk about export markets in 2017, and countries like China are going to matter a lot in terms of our ability to move product to them. But we're not done with the situation of very large runs of pork supplies as we look ahead.
Scott, anything else this week?
I think that's it. It's good to got a short week, and we'll see what happens between now and the end of the year. It's good to continue to talk about maybe some more positive news from a producer standpoint, especially when you look at cattle markets relative to what's been a pretty tough 2016.
Scott, we will talk to you next Friday. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving to you as well, Megan.
And to all of our viewers, happy Thanksgiving to you and your family. To have our weekly livestock market report delivered to your inbox every Saturday morning, visit brownfieldagnews.com. and click subscribe. You can also submit questions to Scott and myself there as well. I'm Megan Grebner on Brownfield.